Hello and welcome. My name is Graham Ratcliffe, and I'm head of SAP New Ventures and Technologies, where we are future-proofing SAP through technology exploration, product incubation, and startup innovation. And we're here today to discuss what's next, creating personalized enterprise software experiences. Today, we will dive into the topic and have a joint conversation with fellow contributors, Debika, Christoph, Muneyb, and Muneyb, from our annual magazine, Horizons by SAP. Before we actually have that discussion, just a few quick words on the magazine and how it brought us all together today. Horizons by SAP is a future-focused journal where forward thinkers in the global tech ecosystem share perspectives on how technologies and business trends will impact SAP customers in the future. This edition includes perspectives and insights from respected thought leaders at Mozilla, Microsoft, Big ID, and others, including our three speakers here today. Today, we have three wonderful authors in this virtual room with us who focus their articles on virtual infrastructure, software-defined networks, and ethics, and are very qualified to talk about this topic with us today. Debika, Muneyb, Christoph, welcome. Do you quickly want to introduce yourself to the audience?
Thank you, Graham, and very happy to be here. My name is Debika Bhattacharya. I work for Verizon Communications, more specifically Verizon Business Group, which is a $32 billion segment of the company focusing on government and enterprise clients across the world. I run the engineering and solutions organization supporting our largest global clients. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Minhazuddin, and I am the Vice President for Solutions and Product Marketing at VMware. I cover all the portfolio from cloud to security to networking and app modernization for VMware as we help customers across all segments, go from their data center infrastructure towards multi-cloud and modern apps.
Hi, my name is Christoph. I'm a full professor of business ethics here at the Technical University of Munich, and I'm also the director of our new Institute for Ethics in Artificial Intelligence. Here at the IAII, we work closely in cooperation with both the technology as well as the humanities and social sciences in order to work on guidelines and other practical tools to implement ethics in AI solutions.
Great, thanks everyone. Really looking forward to our discussion today. When talking about context-aware IT, we all have examples from the world of consumer apps in our head. Think about Google Maps. I find it hard to imagine navigating the San Francisco Bay Area with a map that doesn't know, where I was, that doesn't know how I was traveling, or wasn't able to intelligently predict what I'm looking for. This is not so much the case when it comes to enterprise software applications. I'd love to hear from all of the panelists today on what's the number one reason in your opinion of why there is this gap today.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think it has to do with consumer apps being really centered around the users for a long period of time. For enterprise software, it's been centered around processes, systems, assets, services, etc. However, we do see that changing because employee experience is as important as customer experience for many large enterprise clients. So I expect to see that changing going forward, Graham.
Yeah, I completely agree.
I think to go back up on Debika's point, the federation of information, of context, of how you share data and where you store them has not been very clear with enterprise software, where people very willingly, for the benefits of context and personalization, are sharing enough amount of data to pinpoint it. When you come to actually infrastructure, where things are stored in silos of infrastructure, be it in the data center, now more in the public clouds, at the edge, that sharing of information is not enough or federated enough for you to provide the right amount of context. But it is changing as we build unifying layers around that.
I believe that one problem, as with not just with these systems, but in other areas as well, the problem is silos and silo thinking. That is why we are reluctant, or at least many companies that we are also working with are reluctant to share and to give access to such data and to use solutions which are on the consumer side already widely in use. And I think that's something we need to take on as a challenge.
Completely agree. So, I think we're already seeing sort of a positive spin from our panelists on, this is coming, what is changing now that we're beginning to see this making its way into enterprise software? Debika, maybe you could start this conversation and help our audience understand, where you see the shift starting to happen.
Yeah, what we've started to see is that expectations of users are changing. Enterprise users now work from multiple locations. They expect to work from anywhere and expect to use any device and be able to access their applications with consistent performance, with secure connectivity. So the expectation has changed, whereas there's location independence now that we didn't have before. And with COVID, that has only accelerated, where we have employees now working in perhaps untrusted environments or with variable broadband access based on their home environments. So what this has done is, as context-based applications are being rolled out, what this has also done is led to a need for infrastructure that is flexible and dynamic. You need to have both the infrastructure that is able to handle and be able to resource up and down as needed to be able to support context-based applications that are rolled out to the end user. And what we've also noticed or what we've learned on speaking with our clients is they need to be able to do this at scale. And to be able to do that, we have to roll out automation as well as network telemetry to ensure that regardless of where the user is, in what environment they are working, that they can still get the information that they need reliably, securely, and with the performance that they have grown to expect.
I love this concept of, we wouldn't have expected this, but COVID, accelerating things. I mean, I think in our industry, we're already seeing this pace of change that's hard to predict. And I think I agree that COVID has only driven that even more. Muneyb, I'd love to get your perspective on this from VMware and Debika, you touched on sort of how people think about infrastructure. I imagine, Muneyb, at VMware you have some pretty interesting infrastructure challenges that your clients present to them, and so would love to get that that perspective from you.
Sure, Graham. And I think what's happened is, again, COVID acceleration, when everybody has thought about accessing, modernizing application, digitally transforming their business. And, I think that has been the talk in the industry for several years. COVID actually did accelerate it. One aspect was, like Debika's point, everybody started working from home and remote working. How do you personalize? How do you secure these folks, remotely? Once you did that, we also saw there was a need, and this is reality, most customers of ours, from an infrastructure perspective, once they got their employees working remotely and securely and, with good performance from home, they started looking at, what's the next 12 months going to look like? A lot of them got a bit of a heart attack because they had planned for disaster recovery when it came to infrastructure for a second side. They had not planned for employees all working 100% remotely as a type of disaster. Once they got through that hurdle, they needed to now create a digital supply chain for their products and services to deliver them to their users who are also remote. And this notion became that I can't have all my infrastructure in a data center. The acceleration towards cloud, the acceleration towards digital transformation has only rapidly increased in the last 7 to 8 months, because what used to be a nice to have in the past, where I'm going to go after new demographics, new business models, but I'm not going to go touch my most business critical enterprise applications because, I have my cash flow. It is highly risky. That perception has changed during COVID and accelerated that, because they are trying to modernize those applications. They are trying to cloud scale those business critical applications now, because in 12 months time, it becomes more about the financial viability of their business. It's not a new innovation that they're going to try. And that's, the acceleration we're seeing through COVID, and the infrastructure is going to scaling outside of like data center into clouds, to the edge, to the user. And how do you keep consistency across all of that? And we're seeing really, really good, uptake and fast innovation happening in that area.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. I think that's, we're seeing very similar trends. We sort of talk about it when you think about what's top of mind for IT. Was first and foremost, how do we have everyone communicate and work remotely? And then second, it was, how do we deal with this, shifting business models? And they were all things that people were actually considering around digital transformation. But, it really put that up to the top of their list to say, this is actually, business critical that we address this now. And as you said, we can't just sort of dip a toe in the water. The consumers have moved and we have to follow them. I'd love to stay with you, Muneyb, and kind of continue this dialogue. When we talk about context aware, there are a number of terms that kind of come to mind around this, right? You can say context aware. People talk a lot about intelligence, right? And we'll hear from Christoph a lot later around the ethics of intelligence and artificial intelligence. People also talk about personalization. So maybe you could just help shed a little bit of light on these different terms for our audience, and how you think about them at VMware.
From a VMware portfolio perspective, we think about the personalization, intelligence, context aware across, modern apps, cloud, employee experience, where we deliver workspaces, to networking and security. Without getting into all of them, I'll give you an example of, personalization, intelligence, context awareness in the sense of security, because security is a big challenge now. A lot of the challenges today and complexity that exist in security is, I feel, talking to a lot of the CISOs and security folks, that they have a lot of tools, and the complexity of the tools is what's keeping them awake. It's on average, most enterprises seem to have about 70 to 75 security tools to secure them, and that complexity is the challenge. Now, the way to get ahead of it is basically to focus on what are the crown jewels you're trying to protect. So at VMware, our approaches we talk about is intrinsic security, is identify the crown jewels. And the crown jewels are the applications and data that you're trying to protect. And how do you, filter all the noise? How do you secure a posture around those applications and data, and retain that posture and software as the apps and data are moving towards multi-cloud or being decomposed into containers? And a lot of tools being used just to focus on those silos. Now, personalization, intelligence, and context aware when it comes to security is kind of pushing the edge of how we deal with it at VMware. Our approach of intrinsic security is establishing that security posture across your, infrastructure, be it in the cloud or your workload, your endpoint, wherever you access your information from or apps from, the network, how do you come through that, your identity access. And we are really personalizing that posture, putting intelligence and context around it, because if you think about how security gets troubleshooted today, it is a lot of telemetry, which is coming in silos of network telemetry, endpoint telemetry, like, antivirus and things like that, network telemetry from firewalls and, things like that, which is very separate. And, zero trust identity access, which is very separate. So you have massive vendors who are pumping this data into common tool sets, like, your SIM tools, where you collect all that data, and then you have a lot of analysts just looking for patterns as to what's gone wrong based on these siloed types of data. At VMware, we're able to actually personalize it to the user. So we actually look at the apps and data and say, who has access to it? Users, identity access, what networks is it supposed to run on? And what type of machines or applications is it supposed to touch, which sit on which type of infrastructure? So we're putting a lot of intelligence and context into how to secure that information. When you actually lock down those type of posture and rules, we believe we reduce that signal to noise ratio of amount of threats and threat vectors and analysis you have to go through by almost 80%. We reduce the attack surface, reduce the signal by just applying those concepts of personalization, context-aware intelligence around how you secure your information. Because in this process, by the way, at VMware itself, our IT team had 100 plus security tools to secure 33,000 VMware employees in 128 locations worldwide. We're now just over a dozen tools because we have, taken this approach, put context awareness, intelligence in just how we secure ourselves and all our users. That's just one example. I could talk about that in every aspect of our solutions, but that is very profound of how to actually secure your business.
We're touching the hard parts of this, right? And it's interesting. We often think about, personalization about being all about the end user and consumer. And, it's super, the way you described it there, Muneyb, it's super powerful to solve some of these hard problems around security. And, when we talk about security, it's one of those topics now that, it's just not it's not a discussion, right? It can't be a nice to have, it can't be an afterthought. If you're building something new in a product and if you have a security issue, it's game over, right? Like, that product can't exist. So we definitely try to encourage people to think about that early on. And there is some great examples. As we talk about this, we talked a lot about data, right? Muneyb, you talked about data. Christoph, I'd love to turn the conversation to you. And, to achieve this kind of personalization and, some of these benefits, we need to track data, right? You have to capture the data. And often that data can be very personal. And as I said, it's utmost importance that it must be protected. So how can and how should software vendors strike this balance between creating personalized offerings, using artificial intelligence, machine learning, and delivering data privacy?
I would like to put this question in a slightly wider context, and that is the question of ethics in artificial intelligence, in data ethics, and similar issues. The point is here that we increasingly find, especially those companies we work with, but also other organizations, that many problems they run into with their systems nowadays. These problems are often not so much purely technological problems, but they are rather problems of ethics in a broad sense. Which means problems of what should I do? How should I program this system? Should I go this way or go that way? As with autonomous cars, for example, should I program it to run into that person or into that person? Here we have a similar issue when it comes to tracking behavior. So we face challenges in doing some trade-offs actually between what we want to achieve and also what are the rules, the ethical rules, the guidelines that we need to follow. I think what is important is to see that the entire system also is not just there for a purpose of efficiency, but it can also improve a lot of things. For example, if you implement certain tracking software, then this is also for a goal that can improve, for example, the customer experience, but also maybe mobility of people, the convenience of people, but also to improve sustainability in many areas, and other issues which improve people's lives, daily lives, and also their work. What is important for companies working in this area is to work on guidelines, ethical guidelines for these systems. I think this is a very important issue. I have also done a lot of work in this area. But then what we will need to see is a kind of collaboration between those people with the technical skills, together with those that have other skills, the so-called soft skills, that have skills in the area of ethics or of law, and we will need to see this on the area of development teams already. Ethics, including, for example, the question of privacy and data security, is not a question that you can put on your wall and say, well, we have the philosophy of ethics. No, it is something that you need to put into the design stage, into the development teams. There are many detailed questions that need to be solved on a daily basis. We do it like this here in my institute. We are putting together our research teams in this way, and we find that companies approaching us, we give them this advice, and I think that is a sensible way to go forward with ethics in this area, and make those systems something that people trust in. I think ultimately what we need to achieve is trust of users in those systems, and then they will use them, and that will be beneficial, of course, for the companies as well.
I loved the ending around this trust piece, because I think that's ultimately we have to understand the value of it, right? And if you want to build a product that people use and continue to use for many years, trust is completely key to that. Debika, I'd love to hear from you at Verizon and how you think about this. I mean, you guys have a wealth of data. I imagine there must be some interesting conversations where you sort of say, "Wow, we could do this, but what about user privacy?" And how are you guys approaching that, and how are you having those conversations in your organization?
Yeah, absolutely, Graham. And I'm really happy, Christoph, you mentioned the word trust. So as Verizon being the largest mobile carrier in the US, we have access to a lot of information and a lot of data. But it's really a question of trust that is paramount. So in all our discussions internally, we talk about how do we use the data responsibly, and under no circumstances would we violate the trust of our customers. Because once that trust is lost, then you will see consumers, users move away from that system. And that doesn't mean that the data and the insights cannot be used. It has to be aggregated and anonymized appropriately. But the fundamental piece is that users, they own their data, and they need to understand fully how, whether it's software providers, mobile providers, system providers, how they're using the data, who they're sharing it with. And that information has to be shared transparently with each of the users. So our position in Verizon is that while we do collect a lot of data, we will not violate our customers' trust and use it in any way without their consent and full understanding of how it might be used.
That's great. That's reassuring to hear. I'm a Verizon customer, so yes, that's good perspective. Muneyb, I'd just like to touch on this with you as well, as I think, when people think about data privacy and these things, they often think about it as being the responsibility of the app, right? The consumer-facing app. Does this matter if you're an infrastructure provider, or do you have to just, is this not a problem that you have to think about?
No, it's very important that you are an infrastructure provider. And, certain examples of, policy and regulations where this is being driven out of government is probably, leading the way is EU with GDPR, where, you have to start thinking about data first as to, who, if you think about just the data lifecycle, who's creating the data? What access do they have to actually get data created? So it starts from access and creation of data to data in transit. How is it being secured? To data at rest. How is it being encrypted and secured in the infrastructure? Again, network to your storage to, and then once you have it, again, how is it being read and write to and updated? To how is it being archived and finally deleted? If you think about that entire data lifecycle and policies, if you actually go read up the GDPR 99 articles, 95 of them are very legal and trust and data privacy based, but 4 of them are IT based. But the 4 of them actually translate into this data lifecycle management as to from access to transit to actually deletion. And it's very important to give it that treatment with policy requirements of how you secure that. So it's kind of a very interesting angle. We always tend to think about it from applications, users, and who's accessing it, from what network, what infrastructure is sitting in its own silos. But if you actually flip it and look at data lifecycle from its creation to its deletion and everything that touches along the way, and how do you secure it? How do you trust it? How do you provide privacy? How do you propose? That's a whole different angle to look at it. And at VMware, we've helped a lot of organizations in Europe kind of help work through their GDPR compliance requirements. And that's not just Europe specific. A lot of other countries in the world are following that data privacy and policy and regulation as well. So it's kind of very relevant, but it's very critical in how you look at it from an infrastructure perspective as well, given that your infrastructure is not stuck in a data center anymore. It's in public clouds, it's in your edge, it's in your house now with more and more COVID working users from the house.
Absolutely. I always think, we should think about when you visit that website or that app and there's a checkbox which says, do you want to store my data, or, do you want to delete my data? We should think about actually, what are all the downstream processes that have to happen and have to work, for that actually to be effective, right, and to go into place. So, I think it's the easy part if you're the website, right? You just provide the checkbox, and then you guys have to deal with the hard part. So, Debika, talking about risks and rewards, and with trust at the forefront. Your article, headline says "Bend, don't break," right? And you guys are currently working on some pretty exciting stuff. Networks that react to environmental changes and make decisions all in real time. I'd love to, as we come towards the end of our session here, I'd love to reflect a little bit and just ask you to, share with others who are setting out to maybe a lot earlier in their journey and are looking to differentiate their product by increasing the level of context awareness. What advice would you give them, and how can they learn from the work that you're doing at Verizon?
Yeah, so in my article, Bend, Don't Break, I talk primarily about software-defined networks. Now, historically, networks have been fairly static. They've been reliant on purpose-built hardware. And it's not been a bad thing because they've been optimized for reliability. There's tremendous experience, in the IT industry around how do you architect networks to provide application performance in a very consistent manner. However, and when we get to context-aware applications, as we've discussed and as Christoph and Muneyb have addressed, the expectations are changing, location is changing. There's just so many changes in the landscape that we need to bend our networks without losing any of the reliability and the other aspects that we've come to depend on. So software-defined networks, or the software-defined infrastructure is not a new concept. It's been applied to data centers many years back, but it's only recently that it's becoming more common in wide area networks. And there's really two concepts to it. First is the separation of the data plane from the control plane in networks, which allows the network layer to become programmable and allows us to be able to make changes at scale. The other piece of it is what we call application-aware routing, which is critical because it dynamically provides the performance that that specific application needs without a lot of manual intervention. And then the other piece is network function virtualization, which is the separation of the actual network function, which today, you have folks with routers, switches, firewalls, load balancers, etc. Instead of having purpose-built hardware for each one of them, you are now able to virtualize that functionality. And we've talked about COVID, and it's, what we've seen is our clients who had adopted software-defined networks and cloud-based architectures, even though they had no idea that COVID was going to impact them the way they did, they were able to react much faster and than those who had not. And I'll give Verizon as an example, right? So normally we would have about 20,000 employees who would work remotely. Verizon has about 150,000 employees. Between January to March is when we had our employees, whether they were in Asia Pac or EMEA or the US, as the pandemic came in waves, we started having employees working from home. So by mid-March, we had 110,000 employees working from home. Now, what that meant was our network patterns had changed. And all these employees were using VPNs to connect to the corporate network, right? So VPN ports needed to be increased, firewalls needed to be increased. There is no way you can handle that kind of change at scale without having virtual infrastructure where you can spin up and spin down resources when you need it. And the clients who had invested in it without knowing that COVID was going to hit were able to react much more quickly. And so networks, and this is the thing we tell our clients, is networks have to be dynamic to be able to support, context-aware applications. Like, I'll give another example. We're on a video conference. We use video conferences, frequently these days. But there's a big difference between, like a training video conference application compared to, let's say, a board level meeting or a C-suite broadcast to the organization. Now, with software-defined networks and application-aware routing, these can be handled with the level of support and service needed, even when there are constrained resources. And this can be done through automation, not manually as it had to happen in the past, which allows us to scale the consistent application performance across the organization. And at Verizon, we've been helping our clients with this for many years. And now one of the more interesting applications that we started to see is with arenas and stadiums, where they're looking to do, whether it's facial recognition or temperature sensing for fans when they start coming into the stadiums again. Now, you only want the resources to do this on game day, right? You don't need to have all the resources to do really complex computations and real-time analysis on days where you don't have an event at the stadium. So with software-defined networking, what you can do is you can flex your resources so you have them when you need and then remove them when you don't, right? And that is a critical benefit, because otherwise you would be designing your infrastructure to maximum capacity when you don't need maximum capacity all the time. So this is, designing your network and making sure that you've implemented it the right way, making sure you've built your end-to-end processes, which is critical to make sure that you're getting the benefits of software-defined networks is what we've seen. We've learned that it's important to start simple. Learn the technology, change your processes, and then start adding complexity so that you can then get to environments that are fully automated, it's fully self-healing. But what you don't want is to move too fast before you've understood the second and third order effects of what you might be changing. So we consider our best customers to be informed and educated customers. So we encourage them to learn the technology. We help them with workshops, we understand their environment, and we really look to how they can deploy and implement a software-defined infrastructure and environment that's going to benefit not just the network, but it's going to have far-reaching benefits across the user experience, the applications, security, and everything else that the enterprise is shooting for. So once again, bend, don't break.
What asks do you have for the listeners today, and how can they learn more or move forward on this topic?
I would like to invite all the listeners to take part in some of the activities that we have over here. In particular, we have an upcoming online event called the Responsible AI Forum very soon. But we also have a platform here for interacting and engaging between academia, industry and civil society. And I think this is something very important that we will face in the future. There are too many problems in this area which cannot be solved by either industry alone or by other parts of society. But I think we need this interaction and mutual collaboration in order to tackle the future challenges.
Yeah, I think the big ask would be that as you think about accelerating your business through this, COVID and environment, is think about how you can leverage future technologies, become more future ready, not just for your workforce who will continue to be very remote, but also for your infrastructure, for your applications, and how you would connect with your users, and obviously in a secure and reliable way, because the new normal, as we all talk about, is going to be very digital, and it's out of your comfort zone. So make sure that you can as businesses, you can have consistent infrastructure operations, intelligence, application security, end to end for your employees and your customers yourself, so you can thrive and not be impacted by what's going on in this current situation.
Thank you, everyone. I certainly enjoyed this discussion. I think it's a bright future when we think about what we can do, how we can do it with trust, for consumers. We really just scratched the surface on this topic of context-aware IT. More information, there's one other TechEd session that I'd invite you to join, INT 129, which is the SAP Technology Radar, where we're looking at emerging technologies. And so we'll touch on some of the topics we talked about today, but go much deeper on, where we see the future technologies. Please continue your learning experience with TechEd 2020. There's a number of great assets here. And so I encourage you to engage. There's lots of amazing content. Thank you for joining us today. And thank you to our three panelists. Great session. Thank you.